finish up with our introduction to vertebrates and then talking about fish. No, it's not.
Okay.
All right, so let's talk about, so we are in animal kingdom. Okay. We're talking in this section about the vertebrates. So what are vertebrates?
The spinal cord. Backbone.
Let's say a backbone. Technically it's a backbone, but it's a little, it's a pretty fine distinction. We'll talk about that in a second. But we're going to talk about animals that have a backbone are called vertebrates. But in terms of taxonomy, so what kingdom are we in? Animal. What phylum are vertebrates in? I've mentioned it a few times. Not quite. We're going to get there in a minute.
Starts with the C.
It does.
Starts with a C, like chordates.
Yeah. So we're kingdom animal, phylum chordata, technically. So these are the chordates. And chordates technically are animals with a notochord, sort of a stiff, cartilaginous, dorsal structure. But vertebrate is actually a subphylum. Subphylum vertebrata. And so these are the chordates that actually have that protective layer formed into a backbone. And so really vertebrates are a subphylum, not a phylum, but most of the chordates belong in the vertebrate subphylum. So when we talked about the arthropods, what kind of skeleton did they have? Exoskeleton. The vertebrates have a skeleton, but there's another term for it. Exo means outside. Anyone have any idea what prefix would be for an internal skeleton?
Intraskeleton.
Not quite. Good idea, Tom.
Inter.
Not inter, no.
Intra.
Not intra.
I know. I know it starts with an E again.
Yeah, it does.
It's like
If you probably don't know this, but if like your parent ever had to go for the doctor to put like a camera down their throat to look at their esophagus and stomach and intestines, there's a word for that called endoscopy. Endo means inside. Okay? So an internal skeleton, yeah, it's called an endoskeleton, an internal skeleton rather than an exoskeleton. And so when we talk about the vertebrates, we'll talk about 5 classes of vertebrates. Although it's not, there's some other classes, but we're just going to sort of break into 5 groups. These would be what? Fish, amphibians, reptile, and mammals. So we'll talk about each of these groups one at a time. What's that? No, just it has fins. And so we'll talk about them one at a time, starting today with fish. Yeah, Brandon? No? All right, so for each of these groups, as we talk about them, we're going to talk about some unique adaptations that they have, some characteristics, and some examples maybe, and sort of just go over some of the basics of each of these classes. So we'll talk about fish, and one of the distinctive characteristics fish have is a body covered in what? Scales. Scales are some small plates of basically protein that cover the fish, and they overlap. Sort of like shingles on your roof are put on one layer at a time, all overlapping to protect your house from water coming in. Well, these scales also overlap each other like shingles on a roof do. And some fish have very large scales, and you look at the fish, you could see them obviously. Other fish have very, very fine scales where they're very small and you almost can't see them. It almost looks like skin, but they're actually tiny, tiny little scales. You know, if you look at like a bass, you could see the scales are obvious. If you look at a trout, if anyone's a fisherman or a fisherwoman in here, they're very, very fine scales, and so you can't quite see them individually. And they also secrete mucus, these scales. And if you've ever picked up a fish, how many people go fishing regularly? Just a couple? Okay. So if you pick up a fish, you know they're kind of like slippery and a little bit slimy, right? Okay, that's because they're secreting mucus on the outside of their scales. That helps protect them, it helps them move through the water efficiently, and so on. You can actually tell a fish's age by taking a scale, looking at it on the microscope, because they grow, and in warm months when there's a lot of food available, they grow a lot. Cold months when there's not as much food, they grow a little, and you can see a pattern almost like in a tree. You can count the rings in a tree to see how old it is. You can do the same thing with a fish. Yeah, with one scale of a fish. And fish often have something called counter shading. Counter shading is a pattern of coloration when they are darker on the top and lighter on the bottom. And this is a characteristic that's common in fish, but also in birds as well. Lighter on the bottom side, darker on the top side. Does anybody know how this adaptation is useful for the animal? Matt?
If the predators look at them from above, they'll look dark like the bottom of the water area they're in, but if they look at them from below, they'll look like the light coming from above.
Yeah, it's for camouflage. Sometimes it's to avoid predators, other times to sneak up on prey. But having this camouflage, if an animal, a predator is looking from above, like Matt said, at the bottom of the ocean, a darker area is going to blend in better. If a predator is looking from below, okay, the light underside will blend in with the sky better. Same thing with birds. Okay? Birds that might have a predator above or below them often have a light underside, a darker top side. It's called counter shading. So, for example, the salmon, you can see a distinct counter shading pattern in this picture, also in this drawing. I don't know why this guy's covering up his wife's face with the salmon. I guess he's proud of the salmon as well. Another example, you can see the light underside, the dark top side, but that is not a fish, which is
Bird.
a bird. And what is a bird? But it has that counter shading pattern as well. And that's, again, they swim through the water. Predators on top, looking down, see the dark. Predators below, see the light. As we talk about each class of vertebrate, we'll talk about their body temperature. So what are the terms that we're going to use? Warm and cold-blooded. There's actually much better terms that we should use. Ectothermic, meaning outside temperature. What do you think the word that means inside temperature? Endothermic. Those are really better words because cold and warm-blooded, it doesn't mean that their blood is cold or warm, really. They're sort of older terms, but we're still going to use them because they're commonly used. So we're going to talk about for each of these groups whether they're mainly warm or cold-blooded, but there are exceptions to all of them. For example, I'm going to tell you that most fish are what? Cold-blooded. But there are also warm-blooded fish as well. And we're just going to sort of group them all together because the majority are cold-blooded. So what exactly does that mean, cold-blooded? Tom?
They are the temperature that is outside of them.
Yeah, they are not able to generate heat internally. So their body temperature will be based on the outside temperature in the water that they're swimming in. So right now, the bottom of Oneida Lake, okay, there are fish living there, but their body temperature is very, very low, just above freezing. And so in the summer, as that water warms up, their body temperature increases as well. Okay? They don't regulate it internally. And that's what cold-blooded means. Now this is both positives and negatives. So being cold-blooded is a negative because when, in the winter, for example, what are those fish doing in the lake that's, whatever, 33 degrees?
They're themselves in the water.
Yeah, they're not doing much. They're inactive because as the temperature drops, they become slower and slower. Their heart rate drops way down. Their breathing rate drops way down. They're very, very inactive during those cold months. Same thing for example, reptiles over a cold night or in the desert. They're very cold, their body temperature slows way down, and they have to wait until their body temperature warms up to be more active. Okay? They can't survive very well in extreme conditions as well. It's more difficult for them. But there is a positive to being cold-blooded. Anyone know what it might be? Not quite. Habib?
You can like survive easier because you don't have to. So.
You're maybe on the right track.
Maybe like it makes it like harder for all the fish to see them because like it's same temperature as the.
It's a good idea, not quite though. If your body temperature slows way down, your heart rate and your breath rate slows way down, what does that mean? You probably don't need a lot of food. So it requires much less energy. Cold-blooded animals require much less energy because they're not using a lot of calories to keep their body temperature at a certain level. So that's the positive. All right. Fish also have an interesting sense organ that's unique. It's called the lateral line. If you look at a fish closely, you may have seen this before. For example, on this fish, can you see the line running down the side of it? Right here? Yeah, that lateral line is a sense organ. It's made of sort of modified kind of hair epithelial cells. And it is sensitive to motion and vibrations. This allows the fish to sense the water around it, sense if there are other predators or so forth nearby. When fish swim in schools, huge schools, when they sort of all seem to move at the same time, part of the reason why they're able to do that is because this lateral line senses that motion of nearby fish, allowing them to coordinate their behavior. So most fish have that sense organ. For each class, we're also going to talk about reproduction. And we're going to talk about sort of two things regarding their reproduction. All these vertebrates reproduce sexually. Some can also reproduce asexually in certain ways. But when we talk about their methods of sexual reproduction, we're going to talk about where does fertilization of the eggs take place, and where does the development of the embryo take place. Because there's sort of two options. Fertilization can be either internally or external. Inside of the body or outside of the body. Now, where does fertilization take place in fish? Internal or external?
Both, like for some fish it like happens internally, for some it's like.
You're correct, there are some exceptions, but for most fish it happens externally. So for most fish, the female fish, there are different genders in fish, in all of these vertebrates. In fish, the female will release eggs generally into the water. Male fish will release sperm into the water as well. Okay? And some of those sperm cells will fertilize some of those egg cells. They generally have behaviors to coordinate that, so that the female fish and the male fish release eggs and sperm at the same time, so they're more likely that those sperm cells will fertilize the egg cells. If an egg cell isn't fertilized, it doesn't grow, it doesn't develop into an embryo. Okay? You know what the term is for that? You may probably have heard about it. Salmon going upriver to do this. You know the word? Spawning. Have you heard of spawning?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what spawning is. It's this external fertilization. A single female fish can produce tens or hundreds of thousands of eggs at one spawning.
Most will be fine.
What's that?
But most of them are not.
Most of them, many are not even fertilized to begin with. A sperm cell never fertilized, so they can't grow into an embryo. The ones that are fertilized, some of them never make it through development, Some of them are eaten by predators. Yeah, there's lots of reasons. So only a very small percentage actually make it into actual adulthood. Some fish return back to their place of birth to reproduce again, like salmon. Salmon spawn in fresh water, okay? But then most salmon make their way into salt water after they reach adulthood. But then, towards the end of their lives, they migrate back to the place that they were born, and that's where they spawn, and then they die after that. Did you hear? No, caviar are unfertilized sturgeon eggs of fish.
So we're not eating
Not yet. No, it's like eating an egg at the grocery store. You buy an egg from the grocery store. They're not fertilized eggs, so that's why there's no embryo in there. Same thing if you ate caviar. Caviar comes from sturgeon usually. And you could. There used to be. There is still. I know teachers that do this project called Trout in the Classroom. Mr. McNair at the high school used to do it. I don't know if he did when this classroom moved, but they have big, huge tanks, and they raise trout in them. They actually take trout. You can extract eggs from the trout. You could extract sperm from the trout. They mix them together and fertilize the eggs, and they raise those eggs in an aquarium unit into fried little sort of baby fish, and then adult fish, and eventually release them into streams and stuff. So that's interesting. So, yeah.
This all like that, both had in
Oh, really? Yeah, and some fish do have internal fertilization. Most have external though. All right, so then what about development? Where do the embryos develop? Again, this can be internal or external. In fish, most fish, what is it? External. After those eggs are fertilized, they grow out of the fish's body. After fertilization, most fish just leave them and they're on their own to develop. Fish get oxygen through gills. Okay? Gills are adapted to taking oxygen out of water. They take oxygen in, they release carbon dioxide. They're kind of like lungs in land vertebrates, and they work in the water. They don't work well out of the water. They're very, very fine, very thin and delicate. Once the fish is out of the water without the support of the buoyancy of that water, the gills sort of collapse and they're unable to get oxygen. That's why fish can't breathe out of water usually. But fish generally take water into their mouth, and then it goes over their gills and out through an opening. Okay? That opening is covered by a sort of bony plate called the operculum. Okay? So water goes into the fish's mouth. That's why if you watch a fish carefully, if you have an aquarium at home, you see a fish always moving their mouth. They're taking water into their mouth, passing it over their gills, and then back out into the tank. Okay? You can see in here on this fish, you can see the gills bright red. They're surrounded by blood vessels to absorb the oxygen through diffusion. You get rid of carbon dioxide through diffusion. And the covering of those gills is the operculum. Now, if you ever went fishing and you saw, if you catch a fish, and you want to keep it alive while you're fishing the rest of the day, you have these little clamps and you put it into the fish's mouth, and then through the gill opening, and then clip it on the other side, because it's open. The mouth opens to the outside through that operculum. Fish have another interesting organ called the swim bladder. Swim bladder is kind of like a balloon inside of the fish that they can inflate or deflate. And what do you think this would be useful for? Here?
For the depth.
Yeah, for floating, for their buoyancy. If you ever were swimming in a pool, I'm sure you've done this before. You had like a beach ball in the pool, and you try and sink it.
Oh.
Right? The hot stuff smacks you in the chin. You know that's happening, right?
Yeah.
So, what if you take half the air out of that beach ball? Could you still probably float on it? Probably.
Yeah.
What if you let almost all the air out?
You sink.
Probably would sink. Could you swim it down to the bottom of the pool? Probably. That works just like a swim bladder. The fish can inflate the swim bladder. If it's inflated with a lot of air, it floats very high in the water. As it pushes air out, it can sink lower. So if you're like trying to float in the pool, if you inhale very deeply and hold the air in your lungs, how do you float?
Above the water.
Above the water, you float pretty easily. But then if you exhale all that air, you start sinking. Okay? And that's sort of the same principle. Controls how well you float in the water, a swim bladder. So it's a little balloon in there. When I was in college taking a course in ichthyology, the study of fish, we went on a fishing boat in Lake Champlain, and we would, it was like a big research boat, so you put the nets in the water and have the electric winches to haul them up, and you'd spill the fish on board, and we would look at them. We're studying all these various types of fish. What we noticed is some of the fish that we had brought up, they're dead, and their mouth was like open, and they had like a bubble coming out of it.
Huh?
It was their swim bladder. Okay? And what happens is that when these fish were, 60 feet underwater, there's a huge amount of water pressure on them. Just like if you swim to the bottom of the 10-foot pool, how do your ears feel? They hurt, right? It's all the weight of that water is pushing on your eardrums. That's why it hurts. Okay? So at 60 feet underwater, you can imagine there's even more pressure. That keeps the swim bladder pretty small. If you bring them to the surface too quickly, what happens to the pressure on the outside? Yeah, it gets lower and lower, and so the swim bladder starts to swell up. If they can't get rid of the air and it swells up too big, it can crush their internal organs and poke out through their mouth. And that's what happened to those fish that we brought up, some of them. I also, you ever hear of electrofishing?
Yeah.
Is this something else? I did in college and in graduate schools. In electrofishing, you have, I had run it, so I have a backpack that's a generator, and then you have 2 electrodes in each hand, these big wands that go into the water, and when you press the buttons, it sends an electrical current from one to the other. So you walk through the stream, and when you press the button, it sends electrical current through the stream, and it knocks the fish unconscious.
Oh.
No, because you're wearing rubber boots, you have to wear, and you have to be very careful, because usually there's people with you, they net the fish as you stun them. If somebody falls and trips in the water, you have to immediately let go, because otherwise they get shocked as well. It's not enough to kill a person, but they would feel it. So you walk through the water and you sort of just move these things around, you shock all the fish, people net them, you can study them, you can look at them, you can mark them if you need to. And eventually after a few minutes they regain consciousness, most of them, and you can put them back in the water.
Did anyone get shocked?
No, not that I remember. You can't reach into the water and grab something while the electrodes are on. But you can't go fishing like that to catch trout to eat. It's just for research purposes. I mean,
There's a Simpsons episode when he went electrofishing. I tried to pick it up and he did.
all right, for circulatory system. Fish have a simple circulatory system, a 2-chambered heart, a chamber to take blood in, called the atrium, and one to pump blood out, the ventricle. Simple 2-chambered heart. Simple 2-chambered heart. Simple 2-chambered heart. Let's finish up. Yes, to you, Tom. Let's finish up a little anatomy lesson. We have some terms when we're talking about animals, in terms of when we're talking about which side of the organism we're looking at. What do you call the head end of something? Anybody know what term it is? What's that? No? No? It's called the anterior. And what's the tail end called? Posterior. The back side, where the vertebrae are, it's called the dorsal side. You know the opposite word?
Oh, that's what the doors.
No. Dorsal and ventral. And so in this fish, we have the parts, and they're labeled for you. You have the nostril and the eye. The fins, the dorsal fin is the fin on the back of the fish. The tail fin is called the caudal fin. The pectoral fin, these are the anal fin, it's not labeled. The lateral line, and then the operculum, or the gill cover. If we look inside of the fish, okay, we have again the same size. You don't really have to write them again. But here we have the brain of the fish. It's pretty small. It's basically just an enlargement of the spinal cord. spinal cord runs the length of the fish down the back. The swim bladder's inside, it's back here internally. And you can see it connects to the outside for the fish to put air into it or to release air out of it. The heart's down on the ventral part of the fish. Right? It's got an atrium and a ventricle, an entryway for blood to go in, and then a pumping chamber called the ventricle. The gills are back here, sort of behind these arteries, for absorbing oxygen, for getting rid of carbon dioxide. And then you have the digestive organs, the stomach, the intestines, which are here inside the